Welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Grady, and today's guest is Atanu Das. He's the CEO and president of MSDS Writer, LLC, and he manages a team of consultants responsible for researching, authoring, and updating OSHA-compliant safety data sheets, or better known as SDSs, and their international equivalents, and assisting clients with regulatory compliance. Hey, Atanu, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean. Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on. And we've been talking about doing this for a while, and I'm finally glad we kind of made it happen. And welcome. So, SDSs are a big topic in the industry, especially right now. It's environmental compliance reporting season, so that's going to be an interesting. People are looking for these documents, but before we dive into all the elements of SDSs and breaking them down a little bit for the listeners, because I think they're a little complicated at times. Tell us, how you got started in the business and what led you to, start MSDS Writer.
Well, yeah. So I've originally I started out with a degree in hazardous waste management. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty in-depth, specific degree. In fact, my first job was starting out as handling a RCRA violation, or Haz Waste Major, for a large quantity generator, which happened to be a large paper manufacturer. And as you can imagine, I learned pretty much trial by fire. In fact, that interview question was hilarious. It was, they saw my degree that I just graduated like months earlier, and they said, "Hey, guess what? We got a RCRA violation. Can you help us out here?" I thought, wow.
You're like, I'll try.
Exactly. But the amazing part was, it was like within a year, I had that thing solved, figured out, training in place. I mean, that degree just, fit in right exactly where I needed it to be. So I was at the right place at the right time. And then just, over the years, I gained lots of EH&S, environmental health and safety experience, just by wearing other hats, in other companies and in consulting positions. With that, I learned like OSHA stuff, which is the safety end of things, health, some industrial hygiene stuff. And it was in one of those consulting jobs where a colleague of mine, he wound up leaving the consulting firm and going on to a therapeutic drug company. So all of a sudden, just out of the blue, I get a call one day. It's him. He's saying, "Hey, Atanu, do you think you'd help me out? Can you write a safety data sheet?" At that time, it was material safety data sheet for a therapeutic drug that we're coming out with. And you know what? I'll give it a shot.
Why not?
Right? Why not? Let's add that to what I do. So, lo and behold, I found the rules. At that time, it was early stages. Well, I mean, it was well into our hazard communication, and we'll get into that later. But the MSDS part of it, I put it together. It met his needs, and I came up with this website, msdswriter.com. And at that time, you could just easily list our website addresses, find it, buy that domain name, and from there on, it just took off.
So what time were we thinking? Like 90 or what how long ago was that with that?
98.
98. Okay.
Yeah, 98. So not super long ago, but internet was still, at its early
just starting.
And the best part of this, I got a Yahoo listing like for super cheap, not anything, maybe free. And for years, it was like the top 10, no search engine optimization required, no. And if I ask anyone, what does MSDS Writer do? It's kind of in the name, right?
Yeah, I write MSDSs.
But frankly, over the years, it took a lot of tweaking of the message on our website to get people not to ask that question anymore. So
yeah, right.
But it's been picked up ever since. It's a nice niche market. It's almost like what I like to tell our clients is, we're almost like the tax preparers. You can have H&R Block, a set of accountants, do your taxes. We're the people that fill out that paperwork and know what's what. And all the, let's call them loopholes, but let's, and
Yeah, you know
let's
how to,
correct.
be creative with the wording and meeting the intent of the requirements, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
pretty, yeah.
I mean that's a good story. I mean, so about 22 years now you've been doing, MSDS Writer. That's a good run. I mean, you guys are, probably one of the leading writers in the industry. I mean, I know there's competition out there, but you're fairly well established.
Yeah, very much so. And I think what sets us apart is we are kind of the niche author. A lot of people feel like they don't get their needs met with a lot of this stuff, especially using that accountant metaphor again.
Mhm.
Is it something that you can trust with your tax advisor, with your accountant?
Mhm.
Well, we can be trusted. We have people like you see in my name. I have an SDSRP, and that stands for Safety Data Sheet Registered Professional, which is an accreditation was done about 5 to 10 years ago from the AIHA, which is the Association of the Industrial Hygiene uh, for the U.S. So
Mhm.
they codified this. It's a set of tests that we have to keep maintenance points on and keep updated so that these regulations are always current. And at any given hour, every given day, there's a new set of regulations we got to keep
Oh,
track of. So
well, we're gonna get into some of those new regulations that kinda hit a little couple years ago that kinda probably put everybody in a spin, but, let's talk about the purpose and the elements of the hazard communication standard, and, why do we even have this regulation? I think that's what's driving these SDSs, so talk about that.
sure, sure. So this was first adopted in 1983. So under the OSHA guidance, this HCS or Hazard Communication Standard, what it does is it requires manufacturers and importers to evaluate the hazards associated with their chemicals.
Mhm.
And for every hazardous chemical, these manufacturers and importers must develop a container label and a material safety data sheet, as well as provide these to all downstream users of the chemicals. So, in turn, any employer with employees working with these chemicals must
Mm.
also be aware. So you make them aware using a hazard communication program, a written program. It
Mhm.
also consists of training the employees in how to understand those labels and the material safety data sheets. So that's really the element. You're basically trying to ultimately get people to not only have a right to know about safety data sheets, they also have a right to understand the safety data sheets. So that's really the crux of why we have a hazard communication standard in our workplaces. It's really to get our people aware of what.
Yeah, they need to know the hazards or the potential hazards that they may be encountering when they're actually working with the material or handling it. And, you don't want to have people exposed unnecessarily to, chemicals that they don't know that, oh, that burns when it's on your skin, right? I mean, so, safety precautions and, companies don't want to be faced with lawsuits because they didn't do a good job of communicating those hazards, right? So, it's a good law, it's a good standard, and I'm glad we have it. You know, you talked about you've been doing MSDS writing for 20 some years now, and some of the changes over time and knowing the ins and outs of the requirement. But talk a little bit about just a couple years ago, the global harmonization system, the GHS and classification labeling that changed. That was a there was a lot of effort going on in the industry to train people on the new requirements and the updates to the standard, and it essentially changed the name from MSDSs to SDSs. Isn't that right?
That's right, absolutely. And going back to again to the history, even in the years since the HAZCOM standard went into effect, there were really no consistent requirements for what information had to be provided on
Hmm.
those safety data sheets and the corresponding container labels. So it really was a wild west of quality and quantity of the information given for chemicals. So we would see things like, even for the same chemical, you'd see maybe a 2-page MSDS versus a 25-page MSDS for the same
Yeah,
thing.
right.
And because there just wasn't any consistent way to communicate those hazards. So over time, even in 83, OSHA understood that having a coherent and a broadly recognized means to communicate the warnings, this would actually lead to minimizing barriers to international trade. And so
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't until 1992 that the United Nations had a conference on environmental and development. That group actually issued a mandate at that time for a consistent system for hazard classification. So this was formally adopted under the GHS, or Globally Harmonized System, in 2002. So while this isn't really a mandated standard, the GHS, what that does is it provides an approach for countries to use this consistent method for classifying physical, health, and environmental hazards for the chemical mixtures, and developing the corresponding labels and consistent SDSs. So at that time, that actually changed from material safety data sheet to what we're calling safety data sheets now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
OSHA finally got around to adopting this method in 2012 and then revised their HCS accordingly, fully adopting it in 2015. So that's kind of a
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In 2015, there was a huge like, hurry up, everybody! You've got to get this training in if you're going to be doing this work and updating your programs. And there was a bit of some people that were really, like they took it to heart. Others people like, hey, well, we'll get it in our training when we get into the training. But yeah, so that was good. I mean, well, why is it important for companies buying chemicals to ensure that they receive a copy of the SDS associated with those products they're buying? I mean, let's talk about, the importance of the companies understanding that part of the process and make sure, hey, I have a copy of this and I'm going to need it for some reason. Let's talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, first off, manufacturers are legally required to send these safety data sheets for the chemical either with the first shipment or prior to the first shipment. And again, it's required for all downstream users to communicate the issues involved with their hazards. The receiving entity or downstream user of the chemical can then decide if introducing this new chemical into their workplace may cause potential compatibility or safety issues. And then they may decide they may even reject the shipment entirely because it may not fit in with their chemical inventory. There could be more hazardous chemicals introduced into the workplace. They may not want to do that. So this gives them a way to kind of vet the chemical before it reaches their workplace. That's really the main reason they're keeping that copy on hand.
Well, and then are there other like employer responsibilities for the SDS with employees that they, need to be able to or that they should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like we said earlier, so it's ultimately the employer's responsibility to ensure a workplace that's safe and free of harm. So the way they do that is they're maintaining the chemical inventory of all those physical and chemical hazards, and the associated safety data sheets with those chemical.
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is they keep these on file in a readily accessible place so that when or if the employee, I should say, is working with those chemicals, they're involved in a accident or an incident. If it gets in their eye, on their face, they need to know how to deal with that right away
Mm-hmm.
in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to be trained exactly how to read it, understand it, and and how to deal with the accident and the issue in working with that chemical.
Well, talk a little bit about like so the employers are responsible for providing access to these documents, but one way is putting them in a binder. What about other ways? I mean, what about some technology that's out in the industry right now? Let's touch on SDS management from an online tool perspective, so everyone can like on their phone get access to an SDS if they need to. Like they can scan a label and pops up the details of an SDS that they need to know about. I mean, isn't that what's really kind of like changing the way we think of SDSs in the industry right now?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned this. So over the years, we've graduated from a stale old three ring binder that keeps real old outdated information. those sheets never get updated. You know, I've walked through plants where those 3-ring binders are just covered in dust.
We've all done some audits like that before, right? It's like,
Exactly.
this whole SDS goes back from, well, that's an MSDS. It goes back 10 years and you haven't updated it.
And then guess what? That's low-hanging fruit for an OSHA inspector. When they walk through, they're going to randomly pick an employee on the work floor and ask them, hey, you know, how do you find information for this? Oh, it's in our 3-ring binder. Where is it?
Yeah, show me, right?
Show
And
me.
then let's go and find that SDS so
Right.
we can, look at it and see if there are any hazards you should be aware of or whatever. And I think that's where, a lot of employers get kind of complacent, right? They get complacent in the sense that, hey, I got it, it's in a storage, or, I got the maintenance guy taking care of that.
Right.
Right. I mean, because they're the ones buying all the degreasers and the WD-40 and stuff. And, they're the ones taking care of that. And well, maybe, I mean, or is it the safety guy's responsibility? Or is it the procurement guy's responsibility? Or what about the environmental guy? Right. So it's like people are pointing fingers and not taking accountability on this whole process at times. And talk about some challenges in that, because I think people need to understand it can be complicated.
Oh, very much so. And especially, you have to get buy-in from ultimately your line worker. If they're not aware, and like I said, if an OSHA inspector just comes and randomly asks a question, hey, what's in this bottle you're using? If it's not labeled right, or if it's not in the right language, maybe you have a predominantly foreign language or Spanish speaking workforce. Is that container label easy to understand? Is it in English? Is it in Spanish? Are you training your people in those applicable languages? It starts with your floor person, your management. They all have to buy into this. And if you're not, I mean, it's this hazard communication violations are always within the top 10, if not the top 5 every year. Whenever you see a list of top 10 violations, hazard communication is always in the top 5.
And yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a challenge for companies to stay on top of that. And, digital technologies can assist with just maintaining that and having a point person that, it's responsible for updating the inventory or updating those SDSs as they purchase. And, I think, I sell, I kind of do that on a day job as, sell SDS software. So those are kind of neat, good tools to provide support of companies who need that component in their management system, because whether you're ISO certified and you're trying to maintain an EMS system, well, you better have a good documentation trail for SDSs and you better have your good HAZCOM, and it makes sense to have it all connected, right?
Oh, 100%, yeah.
And then how do you get pulled in to companies when they're struggling to make sure that the SDS either has the information that they think they need, or maybe they got a product they started to create and they're like, I need to create something, like, because we're selling a product, and that's the perfect probably time to bring you in, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I mentioned, so you've got the importer, you've got the manufacturer, you've got the employer. All 3 of those can be affected by having a compliant safety data sheet. So, so just taking the manufacturer's point of view, if they're working on a new chemical, you have to work on getting the right physical chemical property information. At a minimum, a lot of times we're looking at if it's a liquid, pH, flash point, boiling point mixture testing, in addition to the formulation information. So we're going to look at raw material safety data sheets. We're going to look at other data, toxicity data, and again, we'll get into that with sections of these SDSs. But these are all required in order to create and using those GHS rules. So it's a codified set of rules under the globally harmonized system.
Mm-hmm.
Look at, for example, if a product has flammable qualities, you're going to look and see if certain thresholds are met, it may meet a flammable liquid hazard classification.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, it requires a certain set of warnings, warning words, warning statements, a set of hazard precautionary statements that are consistent around the world. And that's the harmonization piece of why we have these statements. As I mentioned earlier, if you have this wild west of safety data sheets, you're going to get a hodgepodge of stuff saying, rinse eyes with water or use something else, and it's just not making sense.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, hodgepodge kind of creates risk and accidents will happen
Yeah,
because someone's going to get hurt
yeah,
typically, because there's confusion and they don't understand, right?
right. And that led to, better pictograms. You may see out there, there's symbols that look pretty straightforward, the skull and crossbones. You kind
Mm-hmm.
of know what that means right away. And it doesn't take a lot of language to tell you that this is something I should be aware of if I'm
Mm-hmm.
handling it in the workplace.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. So, all right, well, let's just do a little deep dive and break down the SDS. I mean, how many sections are we talking about in the SDS?
So there are 16 mandated sections, and these are spelled out very clearly in the OSHA regs. Specifically, you'll find them in 29 CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, 1910, 1200. And in Appendix D is where you're going to find your mandatory section headers. And it starts out real simply. The identification is Section 1. That's
Mm-hmm.
real simple. It's going to be your product identifier, the name of the actual chemical that you're using, any synonyms involved with those chemicals, of course, the recommended use, and then who makes it, who's the manufacturer. So you're going to need your company name, address, emergency phone number, and any responsible people to call in case of an emergency.
Now, let's talk about that phone number. Is that supposed to be manned 24/7?
Not really. So it actually under OSHA letters of interpretation, you are supposed to have it answered by somebody knowledgeable within a work shift. So if your typical work shift is an 8-hour work shift, you should be expecting somebody to answer within that 8 hours. The 24 hours, it's nice to have that. The 24 hours is a lot more helpful for if your chemical is involved in a overnight transportation hazard, or you have an emergency um, visit to a doctor and your employee goes to a hospital late at night. That's where it's going to be important to have some potentially 24 hours response time, but it's not really required. So over the years this was interpreted by OSHA to mean a workplace work shift.
I guess they probably also fall back on the fact that, all the information in the SDS should provide a responder or somebody else enough information to know how to deal with the chemical and not have to rely on somebody specifically at the manufacturer of the company for, to address a question associated with the product. I mean, right? Would that be kind of right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's the point. I mean, as much information as you can get onto a safety data sheet without overwhelming, the end user. And certainly you're going to have your doctors that are going to know about toxicity information. They're going to understand later sections of the SDS as it pertains to the specific hazard of the chemical.
Okay, so we got identification is one, basically hitting the high level. It's who's the, what's the name of the chemical and who manufactured it, how to get a hold of these guys. What's number two?
Number two is your hazard identification. So, as I mentioned earlier, you have these sets of rules that you, as an evaluator of the chemical, have to use these classification guidelines. And again, you're classifying all the various endpoints that deal with the physical hazard, the health hazard, and optionally, and in the U.S., you are optionally, you should be classifying the environmental hazard, but OSHA does not require that. It's more in regards to EPA requirements. So when you do find out the hazard classification according to those endpoints, you're going to, in this section, section 2, this is where you're going to have your signal word and the associated hazard statements, precautionary statements, all that are consistent, and you'll see them outlined. If you have, for example, a flammable liquid, you must use these prescribed um, printed precautionary statements as stated in the regulations. And then the associated pictogram must also be listed in this section. And what you do to do the proper classification you look at all hazardous components of your product that are listed either at 1% for your physical and some health hazards, or 0.1%. Now, 0.1% is for things like carcinogen, reproductive hazard, or mutagenic hazards. As you can see,
Mm-hmm.
that's 0.1% looks at a much lower threshold because those are more damaging potentially to.
Well, let's dive into that. I want to double click on that carcinogenic hazard concept. PFAS is such a big topic right now in the industry, and polyfluoroalkyl substances are now they're the forever chemical, and the exposure concentration level of those chemicals are so low.
Right.
How now are the companies dealing with that, quote unquote, because technically it's not a hazardous waste or hazardous chemicals per se in the TSCA regulations and whatnot. But I mean, I would imagine companies should be disclosing those types of hazards in here at some point in the near future, if not already. What do you think?
I agree. And that, and we're also looking at like nanoparticles are very cutting edge things that, we have no concept for. These nanoparticles can, cross the brain threshold. There's a brain barrier that we have never even thought of as a hazard. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
PFAS is with the same thing. We just don't have enough data yet, but these should definitely be treated like these same physical and health hazards. So I think the jury's out yet on how these will be handled. But again, OSHA is going to blanket look at this as under general duty clause, really. Under the general duty clause is you have to maintain a safe workplace. And that could mean for hazards just not even identified yet or known. At one time, carcinogen, we used to be working with carcinogens all the time and bathing in it and, just to
Yeah.
have workplace. So PFAS and nanoparticles are going to be potentially regulated as much, if not more, than these, but we ought to start looking at them now.
Yeah, I can imagine there's gonna be a lot of conversation around that with this SDS RP group and through the accreditation piece. I mean, you guys, that's going to be a topic you guys are going to probably do some serious conversations about how to deal with that with writing new SDSs. So
Oh yeah.
interesting. More to come on that, I'm sure. So let's get into section 3 now. We're talking what's this one? This is a
So this,
composition of information or something, or what do we
yeah,
got?
the composition and the information on ingredients. So this is typically your actual formula
Okay.
information.
Mm-hmm.
So, if, for example, if this product is 100% of one substance, then you're going to list the chemical name, your common names of synonyms, any cask number associated with it, as well as any impurities involved in that, as well as if it's a mixture of these substances.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to what I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to provide the chemical concentration, exact percentages of those individual ingredients. However, in the US and actually in other parts of the world, you do have the ability to claim trade secrets if you don't want to identify the exact formula by percent. In that case, you are allowed to claim it as trade secret and not even identify it, or you can do a percentage range of the ingredient in the product, adding it to 100%. And these are all, again, the hazardous materials, hazardous components that do trigger those classification hazards I mentioned earlier.
So in the event that you've got a chemical that might trigger a hazardous constituent, that needs to be reported, maybe on an air permit or emission, and you got trade secret laid there, sitting there, right? And you really need to know the exact concentration. How do you get that?
Right. So this is where it's key to have a very good relationship with your vendor or manufacturer that's supplying you with these products on your workplace. As with these record keeping requirements, it's very important to know exactly what's in it, how much of it is there present at your location. So what we recommend is getting a good non-disclosure agreement in place. If your vendor is hemming and hawing about not wanting to get, to disclose that information,
Mm-hmm.
it might be time to consider maybe another vendor.
Right,
But
because it could have implications in your operations that do cost a lot of money for environmental reporting or managing from a treatment perspective, right? I mean, there's a lot of implications to not understanding that, and I could see why someone might want to change vendors.
absolutely. And if they're being extra incorrigible, I would say definitely find a vendor that will help you out with that, or consider greener alternatives,
Yeah, yeah,
non-hazardous.
that's a really good point. I mean, and I think a lot of companies now are going through that evaluation step, being more sustainable, understanding, what can I take out of the inputs into the system that will reduce my chemical footprint and be more sustainable. So that process is something that I think everybody that's in, the manufacturing process should go through and look at. Well, okay, so that's the ingredient breakdown, and in that section, let's talk about section 4.
So section 4, this now I like to say the next couple sections are specifically important to your end users. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, first aid measures. This is section 4. As the name implies, this is the description of what is necessary for dealing with the different routes of exposure. If, for example, you breathe it in, the chemical, what
Mm-hmm.
is the first aid response? If it gets on your eyes, in your skin, if you swallow it. So you're going to want to know what are the important symptoms, the effects of if it gets on you or in you. And then in that case, how do you deal with the medical intention that may take place immediately? What can you do with first aid on site? And then ultimately, if you have to go see a doctor, what further things you have to do. So the important thing here is to make sure that, these first aid measures do apply to the actual chemical that you're talking about. And, if you guys are mishandling it, misusing it at your workplace, maybe some of these first aid measures that are listed here the manufacturer didn't really think of,
And yeah,
and
didn't
then
intend for it that way, right?
and for it that way. So you have to consider that if it's in your workplace being mishandled in some way, you better find a way to deal with that first aid, if it happens.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And all these sections are really one of those things that I think in a good HAZCOM health and safety program, you're kind of calling out these types of chemicals that and making all your employees aware that here's the ones that you need to really worry about in your day-to-day practice, right?
100%. So, and yeah, again, these should be in plain English. They should be, very easy to understand for your coworker. How do I get this guy to this affected person? If it's on their skin, do I get him quickly to a shower that should be located in my workplace, an eye bath? So all
Mm-hmm.
these things have to be considered when you're working on your emergency plan, your emergency response.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, well, section 5 is what's that one?
Firefighting measures. So again, as the name implies, what are you going to do to extinguish a fire? What are the proper extinguishing agents you should be using? Any specific hazards you should be aware of when this chemical catches fire. In addition to that, any protective equipment that firefighters should be trained to wear when they come to your facility.
Like a full face respirator and right?
Exactly, exactly. Full turnout gear, all of that could be required for the firefighter.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, and I mean, I'm sure that those are things that when these guys show up, you're going to tell them, "Hey, here's your hazard. You better bring these things." I mean, they're bringing it with them, but you might as well tell them before they get into it, right?
Right, right.
And what's section 6 here?
Section 6, your accidental release measures. Again, what happens if this spills in your facility? What precautions should you take? Any protective equipment you should wear? The emergency procedures. These should be spelled out in this section, as well as methods and materials for containing the spill and cleaning it
Mm-hmm.
up, disposing of it properly. So these instructions should be in section 6.
Okay. All right.
So
Um,
yeah, moving on, we've got the handling and storage in section 7. So this, again, instructions to the worker, how you should be safely handling it. Wear gloves when handling it. What are the conditions for safe storage? Should this be in a proper location? Should it be kept out of in a well ventilated area, or kept in a temperature controlled room or properly closed.
Vented, right?
Vented, exactly. Your ventilation is important. Should it be handled in a enclosed box or in a glove box, depending? All these instructions should be listed in 7.
That's good. And then now is labeling part of that one too in storage and handling, or
It
is that
actually is.
that's a,
So yeah, in fact, some of those precautionary statements that are spelled out in GHS do talk about the handling and storage. So those are consistently spelled out. At a minimum you should have, and of course add on to that. And the
mhm.
nice part of that is because it's a statement that's consistent, it's already translated for different parts of the world as a consistent statement to be used across the world.
Okay, all right. So then eight's what's 8?
Exposure controls or personal protection again. So this is where if there are any workplace exposure limits, usually for the US, these are OSHA permissible exposure limits by
Yeah.
that's by the individual chemical. These are listed in the government sources. For example, if you have ACGIH or American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygiene numbers, threshold limit values, any other relative or relevant exposure limits used or recommended by the manufacturer should be listed in this section.
Time weighted averages there and things, right?
Correct. So how much of it can be safely present in your workplace for an 8-hour work shift, for example.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
what.
Yeah, because some manufacturing environments, you can't really avoid some of the exposure that you're gonna, be involved with because of the process, because of the way it's the products manufactured and the products used to do that. And in doing so, you need to have these types of controls in place so you don't overexpose, employees to some of these chemicals that you might be using. So yeah, I mean, that's good to know, and I'm glad that they've got a good section in there to talk about those types of PPE and exposure control. So you're also telling them, hey, you wear, you know, all your basic PPE, and
Safety
if you,
glasses, yeah,
yeah,
gloves,
right,
the respirator if needed, how to, properly handle those respirators. That's always a big issue here in this section.
absolutely. Well, okay, so what's 9?
9 is a big one. This is your physical and chemical properties of the mixture. So this covers everything from the appearance, what physical state, is it liquid, is it solid,
Yeah,
does it have an odor,
boiling point
boiling
and
point? Yeah,
flammability and density, all that good stuff,
all
right?
that good stuff. There's a whole list of those, and we try to say, and the way these rules work is if you've tested or if you haven't tested, you have to fill in these sections and say not determined if you don't have the data, so that the reader knows that there is something that maybe hasn't been tested for, but the manufacturer should be telling you that in
Are
this.
there any basic, like, bare minimums you need to have? I mean, like, you can't just put something in, in this section. You can't just have not available, no data available for any of them, right? I mean, that would be like,
A,
okay,
a
no,
gross misjustice. Yes,
right.
exactly.
What's the minimum here you got to have?
So yeah, I mean, certainly the appearance, if it has any odor, the color, you should have a basic understanding of what the product looks like. It's almost similar to pharmaceutical, like you may see the product insert. It'll tell you this is a pill. It's oval shaped. It's got the letter S on it. These things you should have also. The physical state is should be a no-brainer on this. pH, a lot of times that's a very easy test that can
Hmm.
be done very easily. Flash point also,
Yeah,
especially with liquids, we like to tell our clients at a minimum get us pH, flash point, and boiling point.
gotcha.
So those things get us, 99% of what we need for properly classifying the hazards for a lot of these, common.
So okay, so that's number 9, physical and chemical properties. So what about number 10?
10,
Section 10.
Section 10, right. So this is your stability and reactivity section. So this is what happens if, for example, if it reacts with an incompatible product. What conditions should you avoid? Any reactivity hazards? You have to list any potential hazard decomposition products if it's involved in, again, an accidental release, a fire. What should you be looking out for? Conditions to avoid. keep the material away from sources of ignition, or keep it in a clean room. These are things, otherwise you could have a potential reactive hazard that you should be aware of.
Okay. All right. Okay. And then section 11.
11. Okay, so section 11, this is your toxicological information. So again, this ties in nicely to the GHS classification requirements. Here is where you're going to identify information on likely routes of exposure. So again, if the product can, be inhaled, ingested, get on your skin, in your eye, what are the things that can happen? What are the signs to look out for? Any symptoms related to these physical and chemical hazards, the characteristics should be identified here. Immediate or chronic effects from short and long-term exposure. Any acute toxicity information. This should be identified here. There may be some industrial test data that we can list here. If, for example, if it's a carcinogen, this is where you're going to list, component A of this product is known carcinogen.
Mm-hmm.
It's identified on the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC monographs, or by OSHA. So if it's an OSHA known hazard, carcinogen, reproductive hazard, mutagen, etc., this is where you're listing it in this.
When I see, ecological information, I'm also thinking, plant and biological life, besides the human exposure. I mean, is that even addressed in this section, or is it that's just kind of a misnomer a bit?
It's actually in the next section, so it segues nicely to that. So that's actually section 12 is where your ecological information.
Oh, I skipped one there, didn't I? Sorry, fans. I skipped that, ET Nation. I apologize. I got jumped ahead here.
You jumped ahead, but that's good. You're aware, and that's what we're here to get you aware of the community.
That might be a test question.
There you go. That's right. So oddly enough, section 12 is a non-mandatory section under OSHA. The reason being is OSHA doesn't normally have jurisdiction on what is essentially environmental information. So what they say is a complete SDS doesn't necessarily have to have ecological information in there. It's kind of nice to have in there, but the rest of the world requires this. So it's because we have different, leaders in their own sandbox. You've got OSHA here, you've got EPA here, and later on in section 14, you've got DOT, the transportation stuff. So OSHA kind of says in a 16 section format, some of these sections are non-mandatory because of that reason.
Well, wouldn't you have like marine pollutant listed here if it was a marine, carcinogen type exposure issue with,
Exactly. So all your aquatic, terrestrial information, this is ecotoxic data, persistence, biodegradability, bioaccumulation, what happens if it gets in the soil, how mobile is the product. And in addition to that, you may even cover other adverse effects, such as, is your product going to damage the ozone layer? So as you can see,
well, there's a whole nother can of worms. We hit PFAS and ozone, same interview. This is great.
So that, that's the beauty of this communication piece. Safety data sheets can cover quite a lot.
Yeah, right.
It can be a blessing and a curse because, again, people may tend to throw in the kitchen sink, but is it valid kitchen sink material for the end user?
So the next one's section 13. That's going to be what? The
disposal.
Disposal considerations. Yeah. So this one's always important for a lot of people. I mean, you have the product, but then you use it. Now you got to get rid of it because, it's outlasted its usefulness. Now what?
Correct. And again, another non-mandatory section for OSHA, but here's where you're covering your description of the waste. If it's got any safe handling, how do you deal with it? Is there a specific type of method of disposal, including disposal of the contaminated packaging associated with that chemical? So you have to cover all aspects, the packaging material, what, the product itself, has it been processed in any way that could add additional hazards to the waste? This should be covered in this section.
I find this section, routinely light on, what the true actual disposal classification should be for these chemicals. I don't know about you, but if you've got a lot of chemicals that have benzene and other, types of carcinogenic chemicals, and then you get down here and it's like, well, just make sure you properly
To do it in.
characterize it. It's like, you're not helping me, buddy.
And a lot of times I think that is because it's pretty hard for a manufacturer to encompass the range of processing of the product. Yet, if this were Europe, you could add additional sheets and pages dealing with the disposal means of how to handle this, because you have to almost cover every downstream user of the product.
So you need a lot of extra knowledge on properly characterizing waste. A CHMM certification could help you kind of in that aspect of managing. I'm just throwing plugs in here for Gene and, at IHMM too.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, again, this adds to the breadth and depth of knowledge you need for doing all these various sections of a safety database.
Absolutely. Well, get into DOT, another one. I mean, the next one, section 14 is transportation requirements or information. And I I always like, hey, look, here's how we actually ship here's the proper shipping name for this product that we ship it on, which if it's like, here's the pure product or the chemical product when it's not used, or before it's not been, you're going to use it, and here's the shipping name. And a lot of times I don't see that in here sometimes, which is a bit frustrating because, if you're just, maybe the product it basically is it out, it's past its shelf life. And now
Right.
you need to dispose of it. Well, if you have the proper shipping name listed there, that's what it is. I mean, it's going to really help you get rid of things, but that doesn't always come along in these sections on SDS. So I always find that,
Frustrating, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's like, come on, give us a little more details here.
And it is, again, because I mean, especially with the DOT requirements, you have to be trained and then annually get trained every 3 years, take the whole course again. You may not have people on staff to know how to do these transportation proper shipping names.
Oh,
And that's usually why you see a lot of empty spots in this section.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the industry is always being challenged with turnover and continuity in operations to know what's going on, and these regulations are complicated.
Very
They're not
much.
straightforward. So let's go to the next section. 15
15 is
is
regulatory information. So
okay.
again, this is not specifically spelled out exactly what regulations you need to fill out in another non-mandatory OSHA section here. Typically, what they say is it should have any relevant safety, health, and environmental regulations specific for the product in question. Well, that doesn't tell you quite a lot here, but
Yeah.
it's a good guidepost. If something here is where you might be listing if there's Prop 65 in California, this might tell you that be aware that a component or two of this product is identified as a Prop 65.
Or EPCRA,
Yeah,
311, 312,
absolutely. But it's not a kitchen sink either. That you don't expect this to be an exhaustive list, just like the other sections. You may not have enough people that are fully aware of all the standards. It's a good guidepost. Take a look at this. It'll help you with reporting requirements if needed. But this is where you're typically going to find any applicable regulatory information.
All right. In the last section, we're getting to the last section. That was a good breakdown. This is the last one. We'll talk about that one.
And finally, so yeah, section 16, just a more catch-all other information. So this would be including the date of preparation, the date of when this SDS was made, or any adopted changes to it. So you should have kind of a revision history. A lot of times I've seen glossaries, keyword lists, sometimes even our old NFPA, HMIS labeling is put here. So this is another spot where you can put more information as you think might pertain to the chemical.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Well, that's a good rundown, high level. I mean, there's a lot of detail in this, listeners. So think about that when you start to really, dissect these sections and how it applies to what you're doing. But let's talk about how it applies to what you do in a second. Like for instance, a lot of chemicals that you're managing at a site. How are they being used to comply with environmental, regulations? Especially environmental reporting, and what's the importance of having these documents readily available?
So yeah, it is quite important. In fact, one such example is for complying with the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. So if you are an EPCRA facility, you are required to keep your SDSs and provide these to either your state emergency response commission or your local emergency planning committee and your local fire department. So what that is you're providing them with a list of these hazardous chemicals, what to do in case of a release. Your community has a right to know adjoining your facility. What are you handling? Additionally, you have to maintain and report on what's called a Tier 2 report. So this details the chemical names, how much of it you have on site on a given daily basis, where are you storing it, and the location of it. And this report is due annually on March 1st. So we're coming up on a reporting deadline every year, March 1st. Like clockwork, you got to put this in place. So
yeah, you got to keep documentation of the amounts and quantities of these products that you're storing, and be able to report on this. And it is a process, and you really need to be able to identify what you have, and this is the best way to have a good handle on that, is having these SDSs available. um you know Talk about evaluating your chemical footprint. We did touch a little bit about that earlier, but let's get into this a little bit. I mean, your chemical footprint, how does that affect my waste management activities? How important is it to have your procurement staff and your environmental staff, kind of working together to kind of meet sustainability goals?
oh, 100%. I mean, the biggest thing that we help a lot of our clients on is procurement. What we find is specifically for safety data sheets, we're finding outdated information. We're seeing that maybe purchasing without consulting with their environmental group, they're bringing in hazardous things that really are going to throw off a site's, way of sustaining green products or green manufacturing. Suddenly, a big uh, nasty chemical A started coming in on the site only because a purchaser thought, well, you know what? I've heard we've used this in the past. Why don't we do this again?
Yeah, it's a good deal. I'll buy it because I got a bargain. And now they didn't realize they just added a hazardous waste to the site. They're spending thousands of dollars to dispose of the waste.
Right.
Oh, by the way, now I've got to have a new generator ID because I was a conditionally exempt. I'm now LQG. Oh man, now I've got a hazardous waste contingency plan to put together. I got a waste minimization plan to put together. I've got record training to do. I got annual waste reports to do. I mean, I've got problems. I got weekly inspections to do. You just added, you could add hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of compliance obligation because a purchasing agent didn't properly think about, the impact of the chemical they're purchasing.
Right. And that's why I like to say, if you have EHS staff, get them involved in your purchasing group. Have regular meetings with them.
Absolutely.
Explain the reason why you're not allowing certain chemicals on your site, or here are the questions you need to ask your vendor, your supplier, before this a bottle of this chemical shows up unexpectedly and you got to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's really good. I mean, how can an outside vendor like yourself help companies, author SDSs?
Yeah, so the issue, as we've been talking about, this is a pretty complex document. There's a lot of reviewing of data going on to prepare a safety data sheet. These regulations are changing, almost every other day, it feels like. And if you're doing worldwide compliance, you're just now adding incredible
More complexity.
right? So you better hope you either have the people on staff, which
Yeah.
is getting harder and harder these days, or outsource this. A good outside vendor should have competent authors, that are like myself, registered safety data sheet professionals, and also carry liability insurance. They're going to have to be aware of they're working with your formula. They're going to know what the applicability is. They're going to know, and in talking with you, how to properly use this product and comply with the worldwide requirements that you have to deal with when you are selling your product.
Yeah, no, that's a great advice there. Absolutely. And so, people that are out there listening to this, I mean, if you are in need of an author, an SDS author, and you're looking, I mean, I highly recommend Atanu here and his company, MSDS Writer, because he's been doing it for 22 years or more, and he knows the ins and outs. So, give him a call. We'll have his contact information, within the podcast and on my website. So certainly want you to kind of reach out to him. But real quick, how often do SDSs need to be updated?
So in the olden days, prior to GHS, the requirement was 3 years, every 3 years, and that originally came from a requirement in Canada. It was just kind of good practice there that got adopted here. But in fact, after the GHS was fully adopted by both Canada and US, that 3 year kind of went away. But now it is the moment a chemical manufacturer is aware of any change, any significant information that could affect hazards of the chemical.
The concentration changes a bit,
Yeah, you reformulate.
That's a big one, right?
Oh, big time. And maybe, it puts you into a more hazardous category. You're going to have to be aware of that, inform your new with the new SDS within 90 days. So
Oh, wow. So there's significant obligation. And then, I mean, how do you figure that out? How do you, comply? I mean, who's checking that?
Right. So going back to what you said earlier, this is where having an electronic database or something that'll flag
Yeah.
something new has come in. Gone are the days where your old 3-ring binder is just sitting there not being updated. You can program it in place to regularly check in with your vendors, check in with your suppliers, give them a call, check the website.
Yep.
It'll get it automatically updated for you and flag it. And that's a nice way for your reporting requirements as well.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's good. Well, how can people get a hold of you, Atanu, if they need help with SDS writing and some consulting support in this space?
Sure. So our website is msdswriter.com, or we also have sdswriter.com. It'll get you to the same place. So I thought ahead and bought that domain name too. And then you can pick up the phone and dial 800-285-7237, and we'll be glad to help you out.
That's good. Atanu, hey, this was great. Thanks for coming on to the show today. And I'm looking forward to getting this out to the masses, and the ET Nation, I'm sure, is going to be excited to hear this new episode, because a lot of good contents, and we're right in the throes of environmental compliance reporting season. Like you said, tier 2s are coming up. Oh, by the way, annual waste reports are coming up, and you need to make sure you got good SDSs documenting your waste. So there's all kinds of good stuff that these things are needed for, and they really help the industry and prevent employee exposure. So thanks for coming on the show. We'll get this out. And, looking forward to some feedback when we hear some from the listeners. So
I appreciate it, Sean. Thank you again for having me on.
You bet, man. We'll talk to you soon. Okay.
All right. Take care.